from my sister's experience, how can I then be able to amplify girls' stories? And again, I didn't have language for it, but I just knew there was something wrong. And then I started to interrogate also my background. Every time I'd go to the village, aunties, grandmothers, in very good faith, would ask things like,
I think I know where this is going. Oh no.
No tapata mtoto lini. You know, and I'm like, is that all like we are supposed to aspire to?
Welcome to Development Dynamics, DD with Maxi, or shall I say, DD with Maria. Hi there, my name is Maria Angela Mina, and I am the Policy and Advocacy Associate at Development Dynamics. Today, we're joined by Joy Zawadi, who's the Executive Director at Akili Dada. And Akili Dada is an organization that deals with African women who lead, enabling them to become leaders and participate in decision-making processes in various sectors. But before we get to that, we're going to understand Joy's journey from childhood to adulthood and understand how her journey has shaped her into the superwoman that she is today. Welcome, Joy. How are you today?
I'm good.
Glad to have you on the podcast. So I'd love to know, what was your childhood experience like?
That was a very tough thing to reflect on. I won't say I had a typical childhood, but it also not too typical. So for context, in fact, one of my earliest memories is we'd be walking in town with my mom, and if I'd hear someone speaking our mother tongue, I would literally turn, because I'm from the coastal part of Kenya, and I always felt like we were so few in Nairobi. And so I always knew that we were different, and I always knew that we were unique. You know, I remember in primary school, all my friends would talk about how their villages were like an hour from Nairobi, and for us it was like 8 hours plus, and we'd have to go on a road trip. And that was just really interesting. So I always knew I was different in that way. And also for context, I grew up in the Moi era, and tribalism was so real and so tangible then. So again, the fact that I was from the coast, raised in Nairobi, it was always something that I knew. I always knew I was different from the rest, and I grew up with stereotypes. Like I remember people saying like, oh, people from the coast are so lazy, they just sit under mango trees, and always wanting to break that stereotype. Or, oh, people from the coast, like their girls are just like waiting to be married, or the only thing they aspire to is how to cook for their husbands and things like that. And so I always knew that that was a stereotype that I had to break. And at a tender age, I knew there was something wrong with that, but I didn't have the language or the framing of it. Also, some of my other memories is I was fortunate. I mean, later on I realized, like when growing up, I knew we weren't rich, but also I knew we weren't poor. But I knew that my parents worked really hard to keep us in school. Like I remember my dad waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning to travel all the way to Thika, where he used to work. And he used to come home late at night just to make sure that we had the school fees to go to a private school, which was a decision my parents took just to give us a better chance. But even as they took that decision, I could see how it impacted their lives. You know, they were working harder. They had less time to spend with us, and just that burden. I also remember growing up in our household, we were never alone. I think the first time it was just my parents and myself. Because later on my siblings moved out, was probably when I was 24. Like we were always living with relatives, a cousin, an uncle, somebody. Like, so our house was always full. And again, because my dad was the firstborn in a polygamous family, he had very many siblings. He always equalized us. So there was no, in as much as technically we were privileged, we didn't necessarily feel that privilege. And so if it was clothes, we would wear the same things with our cousins. There was no special treatment because you're from Nairobi or anything like that. So I also remember growing up in a context where generosity and equality were values. But then again, as a kid, I didn't actually realize those were the values of our families. And so I always used to get shocked when I hear people, it's just them, their parents and the kids. It was like, how are you guys living? Are you even Kenyan? So those are the memories from my childhood. I really enjoyed primary school, by the way. I think I had excellent teachers.
What primary school were you in?
I went to Makini.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I remember having a relationship with all teachers, including even our math teacher, who was a terrorist. He was called Mr. Arutare, and he would terrorize us, but we had such a good relationship with our teachers, and that now in hindsight, I realized also contributed to our academic performance. And so I remember in high school, in primary school, I performed really well. I was one of those kids that appeared in the newspaper. Wow. After KCPE, because I scored the good marks. And when I reflect back on it, I realized just the support from the teachers, the school environment, and all of that. But things started to change when I got to high school for many reasons. One, it was that golden handshake era. And so even for my dad, it got to a point where his employer was actually encouraging people to retire. And so when I was getting into high school, my dad retired. And so it was almost like a tightening of belts. In fact, one of the phrases that I really remember that was really common in our house is, we don't have money for that. We don't have money for that. And so my high school experience was really interesting. Now that when I think back on it, I realize that there are so many dynamics that even impacted me as an individual. So for context, I failed in high school. My grades really dipped. I went to a national school. That presented completely new dynamics, coming from the elation of, you've appeared in the newspaper, everyone in the village is celebrating you. Then you're going to a high school where you're with 200 other girls who all appeared in the newspapers.
Oh, no. And this is Kenya High,
and
right?
this is Kenya High, right? And so it's like, now I realized I was comparing myself a lot to them as performers. Kenya High also really introduced me to the question of social class. Remember I told you, like, I grew up not rich, not poor, but I knew we were okay. So you go to Kenya High and you're exposed to girls who, this was their first time in Nairobi. They're coming from extreme poverty, and you thought you were poor, but really the reality is you are not. And having to just also contend with my own privilege in that way, but at the same time being in a school environment with, the wealthy of the wealthy. I remember, like, during the visiting days, there are some people who, like, they would, people would come with convoys of cars, and they would lay out like huge spreads, and then it's just you and your mom and my sister and my siblings, and you just have a lesson, and they're, we were pretty modest as well. So just contending with that reality that, actually, you're not here and you don't belong here. So where do you belong? And I remember really struggling to reconcile, where is it that I actually fit in? And it also became really clear to me about the importance of having support systems. Thankfully, I have a really good relationship with my parents. But again, so many things came to mind in terms of hindsight. I remember always asking my dad, would you transfer me? And he would say, we'll think about it next term. We'll think about it next term. And the next thing I knew, I was in
You finished.
Form 4 and I finished. And later on, I realized actually it's because he didn't have the resources to transfer me to a private school.
Yeah.
And for a long time, I struggled with that because my elder brothers went to private schools and they finished in private schools. Okay. And my younger sister was in a private school. Yeah. So I always used to ask myself, why is it that I, in the entire family, is the only one who went to a public school? Yeah. But again, like coming out and having talked to my parents later on, that's when I realized actually the resources to take you to a private school are not there. Yeah. And yet you're in this school, so why don't you just work hard and finish and graduate? Yeah. So those are some of the reflections I had about my early childhood. And then other random thoughts that were coming to mind is, I remember at one point I was so adamant that that I would want to adopt children.
Oh yeah.
I have no idea where that thought came from. I don't know. Like I always knew that I would want to adopt, and I think later on it's because I also realized that there are children who don't grow up with a healthy support system. Yeah. Maybe they lose their parents or whatever it is, and so I feel like my heart for social justice really was born out of that space. I also had a random thought that at one point I wanted to be Oprah and interview people.
I see it.
Which was quite interesting. And the other random thought I had is I remember at one point I was really conscious about, and I think it was really because of Wangari Maathai's influence.
Is this still in high school that you're having this reflection?
This was in primary school.
Oh, wow.
I would be conscious about leaving the lights on, leaving the tap running. Wow. Those are things that would irk me. So my life is also colored with those. Childhood rather is colored with those random experiences.
I think those are amazing. And I think you mentioned some key gems here. And I can see the development of your social justice mindset, the stereotypes from your community, and even your father coming from a polygamous family, right? Yeah. And I'd like to ask, how did that shape your mind as you went into uni and help you make the decision on the course you want to study?
So fun fact, I didn't make a decision on the course I wanted to study.
Yeah.
The decision was actually made for me. So as I mentioned, I was a top performer in primary school. Then that dipped when I got to high school. So really what I had actually signed up to study was law. Yeah. And again, during that particular era or dispensation was that you'd either be called to a public university to study either in the mainstream, which you'd be called and be eligible for help and all these other things, or you'd be called for parallel. Okay. So I was called to study law in parallel, but there was a 2-year waiting period. Oh, wow. And so my parents made the decision that you're not going to wait for 2 years to go to uni. So they made the decision for me to go to USIU. Okay. And the other decision that was made, I really wanted to be a journalist. I was like, if I'm not going to be a lawyer, then I'm going to be a journalist.
Because Oprah Winfrey, right?
Because Oprah Winfrey, but actually really the person I really used to look up to was Zain Vaji. Back then she used to work for KTN, and I just used to admire how she speaks, and not just a journalist, I really wanted to be a newscaster. But then stereotypes came into play. So my dad had imagined how I would be called to go and report in Somalia and how it's an unstable country. Yeah. And because I'm a girl, then it's not safe for me. And so he was like, you're not going to do journalism. We'll find you another course. And I remember going into USIU and he spoke with the course advisor then, and someone told him, marketing is a good enough course for your daughter. I think she should do that. And that's how I ended up doing marketing and management. Okay. International Business Administration and marketing and management in USIU. Again, it wasn't really my decision. It was sort of like a culmination of the circumstances that led me to study that course. But life works interestingly. So in USIU, you do 4 years of your studies, and in your final year, you're to undertake an internship. So it just so happened that my brother had a friend whose mom was working for an NGO called Learner Cheshire Disability. And at that time, they were running an exchange program. And so she said to me, look, our organization is having an internship. They're calling for interns to participate in an exchange program. Why don't you put in your application and take your chances? So I applied, and I got the opportunity, and I got to work for Learner Cheshire Disability in the UK. So that was my first also exposure with, when you talk about rights, that was my first exposure with rights, understanding, the lives of persons with disabilities. And because I had done marketing, then I was interning in their communications department. And my job actually was really to look at their stories and how to tell their stories in a humanizing and empowering way. Which again for me was total mind-boggling, because before we left, we visited and toured different locations in Kenya, and just looking at like even homes for persons with disabilities and looking at how they are treated. And why do they even have to be in homes? Most of the time it's because their families, you'd have people who, if they have a mental disability, they would be locked up in even dog cages and things like that. Because their families just don't know how to deal with them. And then moving to the UK and seeing how people who are on the spectrum, right, living on their own and having carers to come in and support them so they can live a dignified life. And the support systems around them in a way that you having a disability doesn't disqualify you from being seen as human. For me was also the first interaction with rights, and also shaped my my career trajectory. So coming back, I graduated, worked in advertising for, I think it was a year and a half, and I was like, no.
Where did you work for advertising?
So I worked in the smaller agencies. There was one branding agency called Diverges, and another branding agency called Habari. And as I worked there, I was like, man, I mean, okay, people are making money in this industry, but I feel like I can do better. I feel like I can do more. But I think that experience with Learner Cheshire really made me realize that you can actually work and have your work have meaning. Not to say that people in advertising don't do meaningful work, but for me personally, it was just that thing of like, how can what I do better people's lives? How can what I do amplify people's experiences? So that's how I ended up in the social justice space.
Oh, wow. And so from that, you decided to leave your mark through communications for human rights and social justice.
I actually didn't know that was what it was called. I just knew, and even then I didn't know that what I was doing was like transferring my skills. All I knew is how can I apply my marketing knowledge and my branding knowledge and experience to amplify these stories and to amplify these experiences.
I think that's beautiful. Okay. And from then you started learning more about human rights. And how did that affect your mindset and your decision to go forth on this career, especially in the era that you were in, post-Moi, right? Post-Moi era, I'm sure there was a lot of human rights abuses. Now, how did that also affect your career decision or motivate you in that sense?
So actually, I feel like what was happening in my personal space also pushed me more. So my sister, who's late now, she came after me, and she was pursuing aviation at the time. And when she was pursuing her student pilot's license, she'd go to school and come back with a lot of anxiety. Like she'd have panic attacks.
Yeah.
Sometimes she'd come crying, or she'd just come in and enter her bed.
Yeah.
And when I would ask her, like, what's going on, you know, it was things like, and I guess for back then it was normal.
Yeah.
And again, we didn't have language for it. So it was things like she'd go to school and her fellow students, I think there were 2 girls in a class of 15.
Yeah.
They'd tell her stuff like, oh, why are you here? When you know, like in the next 5 years you'll be pregnant.
Yeah.
And you know, probably you won't even finish you won't even acquire the relevant hours to fly. Or you shouldn't be here, you should be learning to be a cabin crew.
Oh no.
So she'd experience that kind of bullying, or sometimes they'd be in class and someone would just come and, you know, like grab her bum, you know, and
oh my goodness.
like again at that point we didn't have language for it, so we didn't know it was like sexual harassment, you know. And some of this could even be like from the instructors and stuff. So it really affected her, and even to the point where she wanted to start a mentorship program for young women like herself who are pursuing aviation. Like, how do you navigate all these things? How do you navigate people telling you you don't actually belong here? This space is for young men. And you see, they're taunting her in the process. And so as that was happening to her, in parallel came an opportunity for me to apply for a job to my next employer. I mean, then they were called Center for British Teachers. Now they've changed their name. And they had a girls' education program. So I thought, okay, how can learning from my sister's experience, how can I then be able to amplify girls' stories? And again, I didn't have language for it, but I just knew there was something wrong. And then I started to interrogate also my background. Every time I'd go to the village, aunties, grandmothers, in very good faith, would ask things like,
I think I know where this is going. Oh no.
No utapata mtoto lini? You know, and I'm like, is that all like we are supposed to aspire to? You know, and again, like they're asking in very good faith. You put on a little bit of weight, my mom would get whispers, hey, is your daughter pregnant? You know, so starting to look at that, I started interrogating things like, so the thing about the coast, there are things that have been normalized that are very wrong. So for example, you'd find cousins, relatives, 18-year-olds getting married to very older white men. And our community would just accept that. Because if she gets married to this older man, she'll have, her financial status will change. So she'll be able to build, like let's say for her parents, a home, she'll be able to buy a car. And so those things were normalized, but I started to question myself, like, why is this okay? And because it's, like, at least when I was growing up, it wasn't like young girls, it wasn't like 16-year-olds, it was like 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, but it's still wrong. Like, how are we as a society comfortable with that? Because if you really want to unpack it, it's to some degree sexual exploitation. Because then it's exploiting the fact that this girl is female and she will get married to an older man. And it also happened the same for the younger men. Like, I have cousins, for example, who speak 15 languages. Because as the younger man, if you go and you're a beach boy, you can land an older woman, right? And it's considered okay. But for me, I'm like, that's not okay. It means something is broken in our system. For me to feel like the only way to get out of this situation is to be forced to be married to someone who's older and more privileged than I am to access that privilege. So as these things, started interrogating all these things, and then I got to work for this organization is when now I got introduced to things like, what are the structural barriers that hold women and girls back? What are the things that are anchored in our cultures and our norms that we feel are normal, that we see are okay, but are actually designed to hold people back? So I think light bulbs started going up in my mind of, oh, okay, so this is what this looks like. That was the first time I interacted with the concept of early and forced marriage. I didn't even know that there were, for example, girls in this country who are forced to go through female genital mutilation, who are forced to be married at as early as the age of 9, because the project actually was working across Kenya's arid and semi-arid lands, which is like northeastern. So that's the first time I actually interacted with that. And now I started drawing parallels of, oh, so like this is what's happening in my community. It's not as extreme, but this is essentially what it is. And the forced in itself is not, it's not like in some of these other communities where you don't actually have a right. On our side, it was more of coercion, or like this is normal. This is what happens. It's okay. So I started looking at, oh, this is what's wrong with this picture. And this is what has been irking me, but I didn't have necessarily a language for it.
Okay. So I can see you now have the word for what is happening in your community, and you can identify what is going on. And so how did you go on to making your change on this negative picture? Starting with maybe your first impactful project.
Yeah. That's a tough question. I think for me, the lowest hanging fruit for me was, how do we package the stories and tell them? Back then, I didn't even know they were called stories of change. I thought they were just like testimonials of, this is what education can do to change the trajectory of someone's life. This is what, at that time, our project was intervening on several levels, including offering families cash transfers. And basically what that would mean is that the project would give the families money so that they're releasing the pressure of the economic hardship, which would mean then the need to marry off their girl because of that economic hardship had been eliminated. It was also looking at, how do we make the school environment safer so that these girls can actually stay in school. So by that, it meant looking at things like, how do we even provide water infrastructure in the schools, so that then if I'm on my period, I can wash my underwear and whatever it is and remain safe, so that I don't have to travel several kilometers to go fetch water and face the risk of abduction. It was also looking at, there was a lot of, again, now I realize, advocacy components of helping these communities actually see what is wrong with this picture. And even then, I think my perspective of how to do that has also changed over time. Because I think back then, it was the early 2000s, there was a lot of, this is what your community is doing wrong, and this is how you do it right, which would face a lot of resistance, right? So actually understanding the why communities do things the way they do, and then addressing the why rather than just telling them you're wrong, has been approaches that I'm also learning around advocacy and how to do behavior change. So it really started from like just packaging the stories and putting them in a very human point of view. Like this is Maria, this is why, this is her context, this is her reality, and this is how this intervention has changed her life. That's where really my journey started from. And of course that has, changed over time.
I can really see it building up. Okay. And so where was the next place that you worked in?
So the next place that I worked in was Akili Dada, which was also an interesting story of how I got there. So it happened, in 2013, I lost my sister to a car crash. And, you know, I was working for this organization, and like they were going through a structural change. And so I knew my job was at risk. And then to cope with grief, I signed up for a master's degree. Bad idea. And so as I was in that class, you know, there's all these changes, you know, I've lost my sister, I know I'm going to lose my job. So I literally one day stood up in class and told guys, I'm going to be out of a job in 3 months. So if you know somewhere that is looking to hire a comms person, like, I'm here. And it just happened someone in my class was like, actually, there's this organization that does mentorship for adolescent girls. Why don't you apply for that role? And so that was my next job, and it's still my job currently. But again, because it was the point of entry was communications, then that trajectory continued. But in Akili Dada, I learned how to tell stories differently. So previously, there's this, forgive my French, poverty porn narrative, right? Of, look at Maria, she's suffering because of organization X. Now we've come and we've saved Maria, and look at Maria now, she's nice and clean and shiny. That was the concept of communication that I was coming from, that sort of background. But at Akili Dada, I learned about how to tell the story from an empowering point of view, which really challenged me, because again, remember, I come from marketing. So I'm like, the sub story sells, you know. It's you know, like, nobody wants to hear. It's kind of like the way they say in journalism, if a dog bites a woman, that's not a story. But if the dog, if the woman bites the dog, now that's the story.
Honestly, what it
right? So when I came here and I'm like, oh, we're gonna tell the stories from an empowering point of view, it was very confusing for me, because I was like, what do you mean?
How do you do that?
How do you do that? And so there was a lot of unlearning I had to do about how to humanize the person whose story you're telling, about seeking their informed consent. Like, what part of your story do you want me to tell, Maria? Like, what do you want me to amplify, as opposed to me assuming what would sell the most. Focusing on the things that matter. So because Akili Dada focuses on nurturing the leadership of girls and young women, it was looking at, okay, yes, these circumstances are prevailing. Yes, she comes from a low-income background. Yes, probably she's facing several challenges. She might be coming from a home with domestic violence. She might be coming from a home with extreme poverty, or whatever it is. But it's focusing on what is Maria's leadership? What is she contributing to society? How is she driving social change? And for me, that was very interesting, because at that time I was telling stories of adolescent girls. So I'm like, God, how do you do this? But it was focusing on things like, what are their community service projects, you know, and then weaving in the element of, then this is how access to education is going to amplify this aspect of her life. This is how access to education is going to change her life trajectory. So it's not necessarily focusing on the poverty and the things that she's struggling with, but actually focusing on her potential and what she's contributing to society. So that, again, was a really huge mind shift for me. And now I'm seeing that that's, you know, when people are telling African stories, those are the things we want to bring out. Like, we know the challenges we have on the continent. We know the struggles we know we have poor leaders. But instead of focusing on that, can we also focus on, yes, we have poor leaders, but we have these leaders who are doing 1, 2, 3. Yes, the youth are unemployed, but what else are they doing? They are innovating. They are changing their communities. So
and like looking at what tools they need for empowerment in order to become leaders. Wow. And so let's backtrack a little bit. So during your master's, what did you study?
I studied organizational development. So one of the things I say about myself is I'm a jack of all trades, and I'm proud of
You
that.
are. What did I say, Superwoman?
Yeah. So again, like I mentioned, I literally picked it because I was grieving, and I was like, let me go do a master's and, like figure life out. But I'm a big believer in God and how he just orchestrates your life.
Yeah.
So in the process of learning about organizational development, the things we would learn is how to diagnose, for example, why certain things are not working within a system and how to fix them. We were learning about things like how do you even play positive politics within our work environment, because politics will be there, but how do you navigate that particular space? We were learning about things about impact, and why is amplifying impact important? How do you capture impact, which most people now refer to as monitoring and evaluation? Like one of the very interesting conversations I remember we had in one of our classes is our lecturer was asking us, should corruption be institutionalized in Kenya? And I was like, what do you mean? But it was really getting us to question, right? Kenya is a corrupt society. However, in the West, they're equally as corrupt, but what they call it is facilitation. So in Kenya, if you want to get things to move, you have to bribe all the way from the cleaning lady, literally, right? All the way to the CEO. So how about we flip it on its head, and instead of it being a backhand thing, we look at how can this facilitation costs be built in and made transparent, so that I would know, okay, if I'm going to interact with organization X, this is the extra facilitation I'll have to pay for all of this. Then what happens? You kill corruption, because then it's not a backhanded thing.
Because it's legal. It's per se.
Yeah, it's, well, not legal, but it's like it's built into the structure. And he was challenging us to really interrogate also how we frame things, because that's how it works in Western societies. If you want to get your passport faster, you have to pay a premium rate. That is the facilitation. If you want to get a business contract, so it's not to say corruption is bad, right? And we don't want it to be institutionalized. We don't want it, but it was just getting us to question how we think and how we look at things from a different perspective. Because when you look at it from a different perspective, then you see. Actually, the phrase I learned yesterday was, if you learn to look at things differently, you see things differently. Very true. Right? So it was just questioning us to think about our perspectives and how we address them. We also learned about the importance of strategic thinking and strategic planning. And not from a point of view of, we've developed the strategic plan and it's going to sit, but how do you actually make the strategies to be living? So I actually loved it. I really loved it, because it really got me to think differently about how organizations function, how to make them better. And also, I think the thing that I appreciated the most, though, was there was a course where we were actually exploring ourselves as individuals and as leaders, and looking at our personalities. And that was the first time I realized that I am neither an introvert or an extrovert, that I'm actually on the line, and how that also impacts me. Because if you engage with different circles of my life, some people will be like, oh, Joy, she's very vocal, she's very loud, she's very extroverted. If you talk to some people, they're like, hey, I've never had a peep or a word from her. So it helped me also understand who I am, and so how I need to exist in the world. So that's a point where I realized that, sometimes even when I spend a lot of time with people, I just need a weekend to myself to just like recharge, and be able to come back and re-engage.
I hear you. And what do you think the importance of self-discovery in this sense is for you?
Many things. I think one, it gives you permission and freedom to just be yourself.
Yes.
And like I mentioned, growing up, I always felt like I didn't belong anywhere, right? Like, so I didn't even know I was an introverted kid. So when it was family functions, I was the weird kid in the corner who's like, doesn't even know which cousins to hang out with, you know. I didn't even know that as a middle child that contributed to my introvertedness. Like my elder brother, the one who comes before me, is so loud, and he's that guy who walks into a room and he's like, boss amefika. Like, I'm going to organize these people, I'm going to come. Actually, if he sees this, he may not be too happy. But yeah, like, he's those guys who like commands the room. My dad is also very extroverted. He's, you know, I remember as a kid, at some point, he would like literally go down his phone. This is when Shags for Christmas. And he'd, hey, come, I'm having boozy at my house. You come. So like at some point, we were always full. And like, so for me, it gave me that permission that actually I'm not like my dad, I'm not like my brother, I'm more introverted, and it's okay. Because this is my personality. So it gives you that freedom to just be yourself. It also gives you the tools on how to navigate life. So because my background in career actually started in comms, I was being forced a lot to be, you know, with people, interacting. Sometimes it's back to back, you know, like I remember, because at that time Akili Dada used to run mentoring activities in high schools. So it was every weekend, right? Like, you spent a whole week in the office, and every weekend you're in this girl's school, and then that girl's school, and then that girl's school. And I used to wonder, why do I feel so burnt out? And that, you know, that self-discovery allowed me to realize that actually, because you have some introverted tendencies, then you need to recharge. So what does that look like? It looks like me actually disconnecting from people, from family, and just being able to spend time by myself to recharge my battery. So I think it gives you that freedom and the tools to now also know how to navigate life.
Okay. And you mentioned choosing a master's because you didn't know how to cope with grief. A bit touchy, but would you like to talk more about mental health awareness, especially in school? I think it's the same for many people, especially in their 20s, 30s, trying to find a different way in order to express themselves.
So grief is very complicated.
Very.
I remember when we lost my sister, like, when I said analyzing, our response were very, very different. My firstborn brother, also by virtue because he's Muslim, he was like, she's dead, she's gone. We move on with life. Like, her life is over. You focus on yours and how you move on. And I was so confused because I was like, how, like, she's not here, like, we need to. And he's like, no, she's gone. Like, her story is over. Like, you need to focus on you. And I really struggled with that. The other brother that comes before me, like I told you, he's the, like,
the extroverted one.
The one who organizes everyone. So his way of dealing with the grief was making sure that everybody is sorted. Like, if the logistics need to happen, they are done. If, you know, if thinking about where's the body, how do we get this, how do we get, like, that was his way of coping with grief. And it was also for him the way to almost show a final sign of love or act of love for my sister is by making sure that her funeral,
through acts of service.
Yes, through acts of service was, thank you for that, was organized. Well, but for me, I didn't have a way to ventilate. I remember I told you I'm not really introverted, but I didn't realize then that I'm also a people pleaser. So I was focusing on making sure that everybody else is grieving properly and having a space to ventilate, and I was not thinking about myself. So I took a very avoidant approach to dealing with my grief. So I remember, actually, it was probably 2 weeks after the funeral that I found out, oh, these guys have a course. And I was actually almost late in submitting my application because I was like, let me just avoid this thing and see how to move on. But again, I didn't have language at that point. I didn't even know that that's what was what I was doing. I was trying to avoid this whole big white elephant that is in the room. But it's important also to have tools, because later on, for me personally, faith was a huge anchor for me. So I would find myself really praying a lot, reading the Bible a lot, listening to gospel music a lot, because I'm very spiritual. So that was my anchor. I also learned the importance of cultivating support systems. Me and my sister were so tight. In fact, I thought I never needed any other friend. I'm like, as long as she's there for me, it's good. But then one of my closest friends, actually she's like, there's my niece says there's besties and then there's besties. So one of my besties actually, like, she would come and sleep over every evening. Like, she goes to work for almost, I think, a month, just to be there for me, because she realized, like, your sister is not here, so there's a huge void. And later on, that's when I realized, oh, that's what a support system looks like. And we just hang out and talk and ventilate. And I didn't realize that that's what she was doing for me, was giving me that opportunity. And literally, I would just talk about my sister from morning to night, you know.
And she just listens.
And she would just listen, you know. And so if you ask me now, I'd say particularly because we're living in a context where mental health is really, like, it's on a steady decline. I think it's very important for young people, and for everyone really, to identify and build that support system for you. I have a very good relationship with my mom as well, and my dad. And again, what we would do, like, we're a very tight-knit family. We would actually, like, sit together. And again, from January to December, just talk. Like, we were like, oh, we can't believe she died through a car crash. We can't believe this happened. We'd pray together. But that was what a support system looked like for us. And for me, talking about it really helped, because it's slowly, it stopped being this huge emotion that I didn't know how to deal with. But in talking about it more, I was able to, like, break it down and be like, okay, like, this is the reality. So this is how you deal with the grief. But even as I say that, I realized that what is a support system for me might not be for you. Right? Like, I know people who have difficult relationship with their parents, but it's like, look at how do you cultivate that? It might not be with your parent or your mom, but it might be with your friend. It might be with your sibling. It might be with a colleague. It might be that you have to pay for it, like get a therapist or whatever it is. So it's important for people to reflect on, what does a support system look like for themselves, and how do they anchor on that? I am
amazing. Well, okay, so I guess maybe I would like to ask, what led to you standing up in class and being like, hey guys, I need a job? And then what was your thereafter experience entering Akili Dada? I mean, did you meet Dr. Wanjiro? How did that go?
What made me stand up actually was frustration.
Was it physical standing up?
It was actually physical standing up. Like, okay, so what kind of, the way our classes would work is at some point the lecturers would, like, pause and like, give us an opportunity to actually apply what we're learning. So I think at that time we were learning about, like, leveraging your networks. You know, like, your next employer might be in the same room as you. So you have to build that confidence and speak up. So as we had learned that, I was like, hey guys, look, you guys are my network and my network. So I do need a new job. And I was frustrated because as a result of the restructuring, it meant that the department I was in and the role I had would be obsolete. And so I was unsure, what does that mean for me? Does it mean I can apply for this role when the new department is set up. And there was a lot of uncertainty. I think there was no communication on what would the next step actually look like. And so at some point I was just really frustrated, and I was like, I can't be dealing with grief and other things. And now here I'm also dealing with not having a job. So I just was like, you know what? The worst that could happen is is that no one in the room would respond, and that's okay.
That's literally the worst thing.
Yes. Yeah. So that's actually what made me like get up and be like, hey guys, I need a job.
Yeah. What an amazing turnout though. And so how was it joining Akili Dada from there? Yeah,
joining Akili Dada was interesting. I felt like I was thrown in the deep end for many reasons. One, it was the first time I actually worked in an organization where it was all women. So all the stereotypes I've grown up with, women are the worst enemies, women bosses are bitches, you know, all those negative things that we hear. For me, I got here and they were debunked terribly, you know, and in a very positive way, right? This was the first time I was in a room and I was told that statement, women are their own worst enemies, is a lie. It's a lie of the devil, you know. But it was backed up with evidence. It was like when a man calls out another man in a boardroom, you don't hear men are their worst enemies.
Exactly.
He's giving that guy feedback, right? And they're given the freedom to give that feedback. So it was like that was debunked. The whole thing of, you know, like female bosses are bitches. Your boss is going to call you out. Your boss is going to hold you accountable.
That's their job.
Why is it that when it's a woman who's giving that constructive feedback, it's framed negatively as she's just being difficult, or she's being, it's like those things were really being debunked for me. I was also learning a lot about structural barriers. Like that was the first time I realized that, for example, the physics that girls learn in high school is different from the physics that boys learn in high school.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh.
And so we would engage with alumni and they would say when they would get into engineering at the university, they were a step behind. Why? Because the young men in their classes had already interacted with like some of these concepts while in high school. And these chicks are like, Allah, we didn't learn this in high school, yet it's not anywhere, right? It's not captured anywhere. So that's the first time I learned, like, when people say they're structural barriers, this is what they mean. So it gave me a lot of language for the things that I was learning. But also I learned the power of mentors. That's the first time I learned this phrase that you can't be what you cannot see.
Yes.
So if I've never seen or interacted with a doctor, my chances of aspiring to be a doctor are really limited.
Yes.
So if girls and young women don't see women in leadership, women in healthy relationships, women in, in spaces that are traditionally not seen to be theirs, then they won't know to aspire to that. And even if they do aspire to that, then they don't have space to interact with people who can give them the tools or share with them the experiences of how they've navigated this. And I remember there was a time we were working with student leaders and someone just mentioned that, for example, if you look at most Kenyan CEOs, they are headhunted from their time they're in university. So you'll find someone who choose to invest in them, mentor them, help them grow. And that happens a lot for younger men, but for younger women, that's hardly there. And so that's why I learned the value of mentorship. And also just really understood what true mentorship was. Mentorship is not like my understanding of mentorship was someone who comes and stands in a room and tells you, girls, you can do well, you know. But mentorship is about sharing your stories candidly and authentically and saying, like, this is how I failed. And failure is not bad. Failure is a part of life. You will navigate this, and just sharing it from a really open and a candid point of view, and how powerful that is in influencing us even as we grow. So it really, my journey in Akili Dada was very uncomfortable.
Oh, okay. Good or bad uncomfortable?
Now in hindsight, I realize good and comfortable, because also it was the first time I interacted with the concept of feminism and how the world is designed to hold women and girls back, and majority of women and girls don't actually even know that. And it comes through socialization. You know, so it was the first time I was, you know, I remember in one of the trainings they were asked, why is it that if a baby girl is jumping around, most times she'll be told, no, don't do that, act like a girl. But if it's a baby boy, like that's really celebrated. And how those things then inform how we grow up. You'll find that if in a family, it's almost an unwritten rule that the girl will have to learn how to cook, how to clean. In most families, it's not the majority. They learn how to do that because they are being nurtured to nurture others. But that's not what happens to the boys. Like very, very, and even if when they learn to cook the hard things. It's like how you're learning how to roast a goat, right? So it's that's the first time I realized, oh, these small things that seem mundane are contributing to how we think. They are contributing to our mental models. They're contributing to how we exist. And it's so funny because it's only after I got married that my husband pointed this out. He's like, when we are in our parents' home, it's like a switch goes on in my brain. In my folks' side. It's like, you know, I'll tie a lasso, I will go to the kitchen, get a water and a jug and wash hands. And he's like, who are you? Like, this is not you in the house. You know, and it's like, I realized that that's how I've been socialized, right? So it comes naturally to me, but it's because it's been years of me functioning like that. And sometimes you don't even realize that that's how.
You truly do not.
You just, that's how you exist. And so that was the first time that I realized that even the things that we call norms and cultures, sometimes we have to really interrogate them to see how do these norms and cultures actually, how are they designed to either hold certain groups of people back or give certain groups of people an advantage over others.
Okay. Wow, okay. When did you get married in between your journey? I mean, we jumped over that. When did baby Imani come in?